thank you so much, Sudhir, and to everybody in the audience for attending. I'd really like to extend a big thank you to the research group for inviting me this evening, and especially big and warm thank you to Sri Lankan Sirkar, my friend and colleague, who did a lot of work behind the scenes to organize this. I don't know if she's in the audience right now, but I just wanted to express appreciation for all that she's done to lay the groundwork for this. So I will begin sharing my screen. And can everybody see my slides?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. Just nudge me if at any point the visuals aren't cooperating.
Will do, and I can confirm that the panelists can see it as well. So.
Wonderful, great. As Sudhir mentioned, and as the title of the talk suggests, I'm speaking about crisis, conjuncture, and concrete politics, some ethnographic notes on the Colombo Port City project. I want to just start by giving a little bit of background on the talk and the kind of context of the talk. So this is actually some material that I'm turning into my a chapter of my book project, which is titled Between Time, Crisis and Development in Post-War Colombo. And what I do with the book is essentially each chapter is sort of a different site of contestation or controversy, or a sort of set of conversations that were primarily relevant in Colombo in the post-war year of 2015. My ethnographic fieldwork was conducted from sort of the end of 2014 through part of 2016 on the subject of aspirational urban development projects in the Sri Lankan capital. So this is only one chapter of that larger book project. These are ideas that I've been thinking about since the years of my fieldwork, but in many ways this feels like a very new kind of talk to be giving, because while the ethnographic material was collected a while ago, I'm really still grappling with a lot of these ideas and thinking about how to sort of thread them together, what kinds of theoretical frameworks to use to make sense of the things that I encountered. And also a large part of the book, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, is actually going to be about sort of revisiting and sort of rethinking some of my material in light of things that have taken place in Sri Lanka since the time of my fieldwork. So there are many kind of layers of reflection embedded in this talk. As those of you in the audience might know who are ethnographers, it can be sometimes a challenge to present what I hope is quite rich ethnographic material from the book in a kind of talk form. So I'll be doing a mix of sort of talking and reading, but this is, unfortunately, just by necessity, it's kind of a very partial overview of what that book chapter on the port city is about. So that's the sort of broader context. Right, so I'd like to begin with 3 images of the port city, all of which can be said in different ways to kind of capture something real about the port city, but also to be somewhat partial in nature. So the image in the top left-hand corner is an image, a computer-generated image produced by the China Harbor Engineering Corporation, which was the company that the Chinese state-owned enterprise that is undertaking the project and that launched construction on the project in September of 2014. The bottom picture is a picture of a protest against the port city, of which there were many in the years 2015 and 2016. In particular, I believe this picture is from 2016. And it kind of, spells out, as you can see on the sign that these people are carrying, spells out a sort of different vision of what the port city is. So instead of this aspirational image in the CGI that's sort of, luxury skyscrapers, office buildings, apartments, canal side living, green space, this sort of beautiful manicured view of the port city. Instead, here we have, this idea that it will destroy the country, that it's bad for Sri Lanka as a whole. And I'll talk a little bit in the talk today about why some people might figuratively or literally gather behind that banner. And the final picture here in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of the port city as I actually saw it, which is to say what a kind of regular person in Colombo would have seen at the time of my field work. And that's a picture taken from a distance because you couldn't actually approach the construction site. It was highly securitized and obviously not open to the public. And most importantly, it's a picture of something that's in process or in progress, but it's clearly not the CGI image. It hasn't quite reached that state of completion. And this is really how most people in the city engaged with the port city. You would sort of see it from a distance, maybe not being able to tell precisely what was going on. At the time when I took this picture, nothing would have actually been going on because the project had been placed on hold, in fact, for much of 2015, which again, I'll talk about more this evening. So in different ways, again, I think that these three images, kind of the tension between them, the differences between them, already, I think, tell us something quite important about the Port City project. So coming back to this CGI first image. So at 1.4 trillion US dollars, which was the total the sort of last time I checked, the port city represents the largest ever foreign direct investment in Sri Lanka's history. And this was an especially controversial development because of the association with China and the fact that the port city, if it were to go ahead, would sort of situate Sri Lanka in this broader kind of, at the time people were calling it the One Belt, One Road initiative. Now it's just kind of called the Belt and Road Initiative, sometimes the New Silk Road or the BRI. But a lot of the controversy around the port city was to do with the idea of what it would mean for Sri Lanka's kind of geopolitical relationships and the growth of Chinese influence on Sri Lankan politics. As you can see now that the image is a little bit larger, hopefully you get a bit more detail. This is, again, kind of an elegant high-end space of leisure and commerce and business. I don't know if people can see my cursor here, my mouse, but here at the bottom corner, this is the sort of existing real Colombo downtown business district, but the actual port city where I'm moving the cursor over here and into the water was going to be, or is going to be, built on dredged land on a sort of artificial man-made island that would then house all of these sort of luxury complexes. So at its very core, this image is already kind of depicting something that doesn't exist. Even the land on which the buildings are standing doesn't exist at the time that this image was created. And in response to some of these ambitious plans and to some of these controversies, many people in Colombo kind of banded together and had quite a lot to say in sort of criticism of the government for accepting this Chinese investment, and organized together to actually try and halt the project. You can sort of see at the bottom of the banner here, People's Movement Against the Port City was the sort of collective name that was chosen. This was a grouping of people comprising clergy members, Buddhist and Christian clergy, primarily from what I saw during my ethnographic work, trade unionists, fisher people, environmentalists, people from different class backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, and very, very different and distinct reasons for opposing the port city. And just returning to something that I had mentioned earlier, one of the things that took place partly as a result of these protests, but I think also for other reasons, the project was actually placed on hold for much of 2015. So from about March 2015 until the end of the year, I think November or December, the project was actually paused. And for a brief moment, it seemed like that people's movement against the port city had actually succeeded in getting people in power to listen to some of their aims, to put this project on hold, and to start a sort of broader conversation and set of debates around whether or not the port city project should go ahead, whether it was actually kind of the best thing for Sri Lanka. And it's in that moment of pause that I'm kind of jumping in with some of my ethnographic work. So the port city was extremely difficult to research in the time that I was living in Colombo, and I've found it to still be rather difficult to research since moving back. So one of the things that I came up against during my fieldwork was that the project was so controversial and so highly securitized that it was really difficult to get any kind of clear information about it. One of the things that I talk about extensively in the chapter is that most of what I knew at the time about the port city, most of what formed sort of the basis of my ethnographic investigation was actually in the form of hearsay and rumors and different kinds of speculation, and not in a lot in the way of concrete facts. Since then, the company has in many ways responded to the public outcry against the project by sort of giving people what they want, or at least giving people what the company imagines that they might want. And one way that this has been evident is through this FAQ section on the CHEC website. So if you walk through these frequently asked questions, you get some really interesting kinds of responses mixed in with some of the more banal kinds of topics. So the questions are grouped, as you can see on the slide, by different sorts of themes. So you get company background, project background, investor relations, and questions about the environment. And like I say, mixed in here with some really banal stuff, some really boring stuff, there's also some extremely revealing types of questions. And I'd like to start tackling one of those now. So this question, what are the overall objectives of the Colombo Port City project? You can see that here, and I will begin reading a little bit from the chapter. So in the weeks and months following the protest marches of March 2015, Colombo residents had many occasions to speculate about the port city and its links to China. Rumors swirled about the project's quote unquote true nature, with many concerned that it represented the ceding of Sri Lankan sovereignty to China. Broadly speaking, fears and rumors about the project's implications fell into 5 categories. First was the question of the environment and the project's potential to cause coastal erosion and damage marine life. The second area of concern was around social inclusion and exclusion. Marketed as a high-end island of luxury, many people expressed fear that the regular residents of Colombo, anyone except for the extremely wealthy, would be barred from entering the premises, which would further sharpen the city's social and economic divisions. The next set of rumors was geopolitical in nature, focusing on the project's relationship to China and the question of whether China would encroach on Sri Lankan maritime and airspace, and what this would do to the country's relations with India and with the United States by extension. The fourth area of concern was about the impact of the project on Colombo's existing infrastructure. People were worried it would cause further strains on the electricity and waste systems of the city, as well as more traffic. And finally, the final set of questions and worries around the port city tended to revolve around issues of employment. The CHEC and Sri Lankan politicians insisted that it would create jobs for Sri Lankan workers, but many people were skeptical, observing that most of the good jobs seemed to go to the Chinese engineers and others already working within the company, thus excluding Sri Lankans from its economic benefits. So as I was saying, today the Port City's official website includes this very carefully crafted FAQ section in which users can click on questions in different categories and sort of guide themselves through all of these sorts of debates. This is a very recent addition, however, and was not available in 2015. If anything, the CHEC came across to many observers as mysterious, bullying, and highly reticent when it came to sharing important facts about the project. The current FAQ section on their website reads almost as if composed in response to the accusations and rumors that many Colombo residents voiced back in 2015. So like all FAQs produced in corporate and institutional environments, these questions are selected and worded in a way that's really designed to preempt controversy and confusion. They take complex issues and distill them into simple queries and responses, presenting these matters as more or less resolved. But while the project was on hold, the questions multiplied and moved through the city. So you can see that the response here is, what are the overall objectives of the project, and the sort of matter-of-fact tone is this thing about becoming an international business destination, right? So Colombo cannot become a destination that appeals to international businesses or tourists with ad hoc developments. The port city provides an opportunity for the old and historic part of the business district to interface as a modern planned metropolis. And then it lists the sort of objectives of this new landmass that's being constructed, speaking about creating a regional business hub, a tourism hub, integrated living, high quality residential facilities, and generating investments. So the port city, the activists against the port city who I met at this protest march, which I describe a bit more in the chapter, I don't have time to go into it now, but essentially the chapter starts with me joining this protest march and sharing some ethnographic field notes from that. The protest that sparked my interest in the project brought together activists of many different kinds. The visible role of Christian and especially Catholic clergy signaled the large presence of these groups in the People's Movement Against the Port City, a coalition that formed to resist the port city's construction. Sri Lanka has a long history of Christian social justice work and liberation theology, which explains the sizable group of nuns and priests who I would regularly see at protest marches and meetings as part of the People's Movement. But the People's Movement included other significant constituencies as well, some of which I've already talked about. The People's Movement activists articulated critiques of the Port City project across the categories that I've already spoken about: environmental, social, geopolitical, infrastructural, and economic. All of these pointed to the overarching belief that the Port City was not really just about the project itself, which goes back to this question, what are the overall objectives? They saw these claims about creating a luxury island and making Colombo a regional business hub as actually masking other kinds of motives. It seemed obvious to everyone I met within the People's Movement that the project was a Trojan horse, ushering in greater Chinese influence and ensuring that Sri Lanka would be controlled by foreigners. So emerging from Sri Lanka's long tradition of left politics and Marxist critique, many of the activists in the movement evoked concepts like capitalism, globalization, and dispossession in their accounts of what the port city was really trying to accomplish. Two of my informants, who I call Father Thomas and Sister Jane, were a Catholic priest and nun who were at the forefront of the movement and worked in a number of progressive social causes. They were particularly vocal against the port city. When I spent time with them in the summer of 2015 in a community center where they organized most of their activities, they described in their own words the kind of economic restructuring that they felt the port city represented. It forces us to work together. It's a time for everyone to learn, Father explained, speaking about the work of holding together an activist coalition. He was convinced that the project would go ahead after parliamentary elections were held to secure the new government's position. Again, this was back in 2015. This had been echoed many times by others I had spoken to in the movement, who feared that the act of putting the port city on hold was only a short-term gesture on the part of the Wickremesinghe Sirisena governing coalition, which would ultimately bend to the pressure of transnational capital and allow the project to go ahead. Sister spoke of the devastating effects of the project on fisher communities, emphasizing the potential impacts far beyond Colombo itself. She described women walking from Negombo to northern Colombo to sell fish, but saying that the port city would destroy these very fish's breeding grounds. And so what would happen to the people who eat this fish, who sell it and who eat it, and what would happen to these women? The poor will lose their entire livelihood to these big fishing vessels, she argued. Father jumped in the same conversation, outlining in his own terms an account of primitive accumulation as he saw it. He said the port city will go ahead because the government cares about the market economy, not the fisher people. It's like the Industrial Revolution, building big cities and having rural people come to work in them. Sister nodded and said, instead of agriculture, the government promotes industry. Now they're not even helping the plantations. Now they want to help tourism, she said. So these poor boys and girls will become the room boys and room girls for the tourists. Father added, any piece of land near a lake or water, they'll put a hotel on it. So using terms like market economy, industry, tourism, father and sister referred to the different sectors of the Sri Lankan economy which were being prioritized in the post-war period. These were contrasted with the agriculture and plantation sectors, which they thought were being left behind. Sister's statement about room boys and room girls was an articulation of how the rural poor who need to migrate to Colombo for work would become embedded eventually in this service economy. To father and sister, the service sector jobs touted by the Port City project leadership, the Sri Lankan government, and international financial institutions were fundamentally lacking in dignity. Already, these two, father and sister, were deeply involved in addressing the social ills of export-led development championed in Sri Lanka since the neoliberal reforms of the late 1970s. They had been working closely with free trade zone workers, many of them young new arrivals to Colombo, to the Colombo periphery from the villages. And because of what they had already seen in the free trade zone, they couldn't help but sort of situate the port city in relation to that, seeing it as just an extension of the already deeply unequal society that they were sort of struggling against. I don't have time to go as much into father and sister's backgrounds now, but I think that gives you a flavor for the kind of critique that they were making, and that sort of represented a good chunk of the people's movement against the port city's platform and what it sort of stood for. Sorry, I'm just seeing a. Great, thank you, Sudhir. So I will try to finish up by just offering some different perspectives. So you've heard from father and sister, from these activists in the people's movement, but what I really want to do in this paper is to, and what I'm trying to accomplish in the chapter, is to not only give voice to those who were against the port city, and something that I try to attend to is some of the pro-port city perspectives and how they came from sometimes surprising and sometimes unsurprising places in Colombo society. So not everyone shared in the critiques of the port city that were circulating around Colombo. To some of my informants, friends, and acquaintances, the port city was a big opportunity for Sri Lanka, and calls to halt the project were merely standing in the way of much needed progress. In this line of thinking, the port city would, quote unquote, put Sri Lanka on the map, a phrase that I heard repeated numerous times. Another common refrain was that it would help Colombo become more like Singapore or Dubai, not only in the well-rehearsed idea of it becoming a powerful, significant city in the Indian Ocean region, but also in the specifics of having a very well-developed waterfront and skyline, which would make it appear aesthetically similar to these model cities. Sri Lankan nationalism often came to the fore in these narratives as well. Development and progress were framed as worthy goals for the nation as a whole. If Chinese investment could propel Colombo towards greater standing internationally, if it could attract greater wealth and prosperity to the city, then the port city was thought to be for the good of the country. So it was not at all uncommon for politically savvy young Colombo residents to simultaneously express excitement about the prospect of the port city and to be anxious about China's influence on the country. And so that's where this text that you see on the screen now comes in. This is a blog post, an excerpt from a blog post from a popular Colombo blogger, Udanjaya Vijaratne, who was among a group of journalists and writers invited to tour the port city with the company's sort of supervision, and to then share his thoughts in this post. And so I quote it at length in the chapter because I think that it reveals a lot about the kind of thinking that's going on here. So he talks about the economic benefits, comparing the much better malls that will come in on this speculative piece of land that will be better than the malls currently on offer in Colombo, which are Majestic City and Crescat, talking sort of speculatively about these international companies, the use of the skilled labor force, etc. And then also this kind of very interesting appeal to quote unquote full-blooded Sri Lankans. And this kind of interpolating of the reader through the use of the pronoun us. We don't have the money ourselves and nobody is willing to give it to us. So basically Sri Lankans have to kind of band together and accept this Chinese influence. And then, you know, he kind of concludes with this sort of somewhat ambiguous sentiment, which is for better or for worse, Chinese influence is coming. Whether we end up turning into Singapore or into Hong Kong remains to be seen. So there's a lot more that I could say about this, and I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A. But what I want to sort of ultimately end on with this portion of the talk, at least, is to kind of give a few thoughts on what I'm trying to do in this chapter that's a little bit different from, I think, what a lot of critical writing on infrastructure does. So anthropologists and geographers have provided us with many deeply critical accounts of infrastructure development in recent years, especially in relation to the gap between what infrastructures promise and what they deliver. A typical account of infrastructure development might go something like this. A political figure or party promises an aspirational new project. The project is thought to represent a chance for national development on a grand scale. The project is conceptualized without consideration for nearby communities, the environment, or the local character. And at this point, it goes ahead, causing mass displacement. Perhaps it functions as promised, but this is usually rare. And more likely, the project is begun, but then it's not completed on time. Hopes for the project's future turn into frustration, and here the ethnographer typically enters the scene, collecting people's narratives of doubt and uncertainty. I'm giving this summary not to be flippant about the lived experience of people around the world who experience these often violent disruptions or upheavals associated with infrastructure development. Nor do I sketch out this story because I disagree with necessarily the way that scholars have narrativized these happenings in their own field sites. But if anything, I lay out the story above because I think it's so ubiquitous that at this point it seems as if it applies just about anywhere. And that's kind of captured by this quote from Ashley Carson and David Neese when they observe that the gap between the obviousness of the unfinished as an empirical phenomenon is somewhat in tension with this aura of theoretical novelty that we give this. I think the problem with that is that I believe that we need to sort of look a little bit more closely at some of the specifics of that uncertainty and ambiguity. And I believe that basically there's been a tension in a lot of critical writing on infrastructure, which sees the project's incompletion as the thing that causes the uncertainty or ambiguity, when in fact what I'm seeking to do in this book chapter and in a lot of my work is not to look at politics in that sort of abstract way or channel abstract ideas of uncertainty or ambiguity. Rather, I really want to give voice to the specific opinions that my informants have, to locate them in the kind of socio-political context from which they're speaking, to think about why they have certain opinions, to think about the fact that quote unquote, the people or the general public of a place like Colombo is not an undifferentiated mass, but contains different kinds of people with very, very different reactions to these sorts of projects. And that's sort of where the reference to concrete politics in the title of this talk really comes in. I think that ethnography is most useful when we actually use the ethnographic method to kind of get into the details of why people might oppose, but also might be for some of these potentially problematic infrastructure projects, rather than speaking at sort of higher levels of abstraction that ignore our informants' voices and stories and particular positions. So I'll end there in terms of my speaking, and I'd be very curious to hear any questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you, Alessandra. Would you want to exit the screen share?
That
Or do you want to keep up this slide?
sort of depends on what people would like. I'll stop the share for now, but if anybody wants me to return to a specific slide for any reason, just let me know.
We can do that. All right. Thank you so much, Alessandra. That was such a interesting talk to listen to, and I really appreciate how you spoke to many different disciplines, from foreign policy to identity and resistance to urban infrastructure to politics. It was really a whirlwind and really appreciative. I'll remind all our attendees, if you'd like to pop some questions in the chat function, I can either read them out to you. If you would prefer to ask Alessandra your questions directly, feel free to just pop that in the chat too, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question too. But yeah, if it's okay, I'm going to take the advantage as the moderator to ask the question. I really appreciated this blend of foreign policy and urban infrastructure and local politics and such, and the resistance, especially talking about the Christian clergy. The one thing I didn't hear you say, and the answer might just be it wasn't as important, is I was wanting to know what your thoughts were, / what your respondents' thoughts were on the role of Sinhalese nationalism in all of this, right? Because I can't remember the specific year, but Rajapaksa government has come in a few years later, has taken a more prominent role. So was this a time when Sinhalese nationalism was just not as important, or was it growing? I know it was important. Is it seen as a resistance to China, to the Chinese influence that could happen? Do Christians see it as a largely dominant ideology after the long war that they've been having? So if you could speak to the role of Sinhalese nationalism to all of this, that would be great.
Absolutely. Do you want me to take a few questions at a time and then kind of come back to several, or?
Why don't we start with this question? I see Peter's popped in a question, but why don't we start with this question and then we collect 3 or 4 and then I can ask you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really, really great question, and it's something that, as I sort of opened the talk by saying, it's really, really challenging to give a talk of this nature, because I'm finding the act of writing the book chapter is complicated, and then the act of sort of thinking about how different arguments I'm making relate to each other is very complicated. So I essentially have a whole separate line of inquiry that I'm kind of looking at turning into I think a standalone article at this point about nationalism in the context of the Port City project. But yeah, just to sketch out sort of in very, very general terms, something that I observed playing out. One of the arguments I'm kind of developing is that I think what I observed in my fieldwork was that after the end of the Civil War, there was kind of this growth in, I guess, what I call like either unitary Sri Lankan nationalism or kind of flexible Sri Lankan nationalism. So some of my work is about the flexibility of a lot of Sinhalese nationalism and how this flexibility works in such a way that it actually appeals to a lot of Sinhalese Christians, causing them to sort of identify with Sinhala nationalism, even though they themselves are not Sinhala Buddhists, and the way that it kind of adapts in this way that I think we need to be attentive to as researchers. With regards to the port city, I think what I was really observing in a lot of conversations I had was that people actually framed Sinhalese nationalism or Sinhala Buddhist nationalism as being kind of on the same side as Chinese nationalism, right? Or being supported by China's intervention. And I was privy to quite a few conversations where people tried to kind of imply that, you know, Tamils, Muslims, and maybe sometimes Christians were sort of had a lot to gain from India and the US being involved in Sri Lanka's affairs, but that the sort of Sinhalese nationalist position should be to welcome Chinese investment, and that the Chinese were kind of great because they hadn't critiqued the Rajapaksa administration, they hadn't critiqued the human rights abuses at the end of the war against Tamil civilians, etc. So I think, yeah, there's like a much longer and sort of more complex paper I would love to write separately that's about the interface of these different nationalisms.
Excellent. Yeah, no, it is fascinating and just got me thinking. So I was curious about
Yeah, it's
the progress,
very
but I would eagerly wait for that paper to come out to read it. So
yeah.
excellent. We have one question from Peter McGowran. Hi, Peter. Peter's asking, was the project ever promised in an election manifesto or similar?
So short answer is yes, in different ways. So so the project was started under Rajapaksa's first, you guess you're trying to figure out the role of the state or government more. Okay.
Exactly.
So the project was started in September 2014, so under Rajapaksa, and then it was kind of interrupted during the coalition government period, which started in January 2015. So this new coalition government was surprisingly brought into power in January 2015. Even more surprisingly, Mahinda Rajapaksa actually stepped down, which nobody was expecting. And then in March of 2015, so about 2 months later, the project was placed on hold. And one of the kind of election promises of the coalition government had been that they would put into question the project's role and that they wouldn't necessarily go ahead with it. But then, interestingly, the sort of plot twist is that they are the ones that actually ended up greenlighting the rest of the project, right? So there are, I guess, a lot of twists and turns in Sri Lankan electoral politics in recent years. But something that I find really interesting is the way that the project was both challenged by that 2015 coalition and then also just reinstated by the same coalition. And part of that had to do with the understanding among many politicians that there was no way to get out of the project without enormous financial repercussions for Sri Lanka.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. If you have a follow-up question, feel free to ask with that. We have a question from Mayank Mishra. He writes, did you observe any potential socio-cultural ramifications on Sri Lankan society, given increasing Chinese investments and workforce? Does this dimension also figure as a larger part of people's resistance?
Yeah, so thank you, Mayank, for that question. I think that that also kind of plays into some of the stuff I was talking about earlier with this other paper I'd like to write about nationalism and ideas of belonging and Chinese investment. So I didn't necessarily observe in my own fieldwork any actual sort of ramifications other than just the presence of a lot of Chinese tourists and visitors to Colombo. It wasn't always possible to tell who was a tourist and who was like living there and working on the project, but you could see it was very visible at the time that I was doing my field work, lots of signs in Chinese and businesses that were clearly set up to cater to a new kind of Chinese workforce or tourism sector. But I think more interesting from that question is what people thought the social ramifications of Chinese presence in Sri Lanka would be. And that was something that I saw playing out a lot in the people's movement against the port city. Activists would speak a lot about using kind of anti-Chinese tropes and stereotypes to kind of talk about the potential destruction of sort of Sri Lankan local values. And so something that I'm interested in talking about and exploring a little bit, which is kind of controversial and delicate and sometimes difficult to discuss, is the fact that the people's movement, whose cause I was quite sympathetic to in many ways, they also trafficked in a lot of tropes that were also kind of troubling about what these supposed, local Sri Lankan values were. And so, for example, something that I want to look at a little bit more is the role of gender. I remember a moment where people's movement activists sort of spoke about, Chinese women were filling the city of Colombo wearing mini skirts and dressing immodestly, and this was really inappropriate. And so looking at the way that that kind of, these sorts of xenophobic kinds of ideas were in tension with some of these social justice ideals that the people's movement espoused.
Excellent. Thank you. Once again, I'd remind you all, if you have any questions, to pop them into the chat there. Yeah, Peter has his hand up. Peter, give me 1 second. I'm going to invite you to, oh, no. Yeah. Peter, you should be able to talk now.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yeah, can hear you.
Yeah, thanks, Alessandro. That was really interesting. I'm a PhD candidate here at King's, looking at slides and disaster risk in the Himalayas. So when I saw your title about concrete and politics and crises and things, I was really interested as well, because I was just writing a chapter, or I've just sent one to my supervisors, which is on sort of concrete and politics in terms of landslide mitigation and road construction in the Himalayas. So I guess, I mean, I'll obviously wait for the chapter or the paper to come out, but I was interested in the kind of the literature that you've been drawing on issues of concrete infrastructure in geography or anthropology, whichever your background is, and what theories or what work you found to be useful in making sense of this kind of complex issue. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Your question actually reveals my own hypocrisy in a way, Peter, because I am kind of using the term concrete figuratively, and I guess I am accusing others of being too figurative when they talk about infrastructure. But yeah, when I use the phrase, I think, you know, what I'm really referring to and what I'm trying to drive home is that I think some of our critical work on infrastructure kind of risks just being a little bit too metaphorical. And I also think risks kind of painting uncertainty or ambiguity as something that's evenly experienced by everyone when they are in places that are experiencing these infrastructure developments. And I think it's quite important to draw out the way that these things are actually differentiated, and that there can be pre-existing political lineages that make people sort of predisposed to either be for or against these kinds of projects, and sort of thinking about politics in a more lively, intimate, everyday kind of way. And that's really what I mean by concrete politics. I mean, I think I've found, you know, a lot of anthropological literature extremely valuable on infrastructure. Obviously, I, you know, like many people probably have drawn a lot from the 2018 kind of edited volume, The Promise of Infrastructure by Nikhil Anand, Hannah Appel, and Akhil Gupta. And I particularly like their introduction and some of their discussion of infrastructure sort of lineage and Marxist thought, how different stages of anthropology, different sort of, schools of thought in anthropology have either neglected infrastructure, and then what it means that we now have an infrastructural turn, so to speak. I also highly recommend that piece that I was citing by Ashley Carson, David Neese about infrastructure. I can send you the title, but it's a 2019 piece in Environment and Society where they kind of make this point about infrastructure's incompleteness being sort of over-studied and kind of treated as a theoretical novelty, when actually it's kind of a given in lots of places. So those are just some of the thinkers that I'm working with, but I've generally just found beyond infrastructure or beyond anthropology or geography, I've just found really thinking with a kind of Marxist sort of lens, thinking about the conjuncture, thinking about sort of concrete political forces has been really important for my work.
Great, thanks. Yeah, please do share the title of the paper. That would be great. Thanks.
Excellent. Sorry, you would think after all this time I would remember to unmute myself. We have about 10 to 15 minutes left, so we can take a few more questions.
I see Iromi Pereira in the attendees, so hi Iromi, I just wanted to say thanks for joining from all the way from Sri Lanka. No pressure.
Oh, that must be really late in the evening there in Sri Lanka, huh?
Yes, I'm assuming I'm assuming Iromi's in Sri Lanka still, I think.
Yeah, she said yes, it's pretty late.
Yeah.
Great. If you don't mind, Alessandra, could I just ask a question I actually just more of a prompt than a question. But because your work is so based on anthropology, and I was really moved by your slide saying this is what the perspective or what I saw of the port city. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your positionality with this whole process vis-a-vis being in Sri Lanka at this time also, because it is a difficult time. Any time after 2008 was a difficult time to be in Sri Lanka, but it's sort of the churning is happening there. And I'm just wondering your experiences and your positionality with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of a layer of, my positionality doing the research in general, and then there's kind of a layer about the port city specifically. So, I found that it was obviously a really, really interesting time to be there, a really devastating time in many ways, but also a very confusing time because there was a lot of hope from January 2015 around the kind of, good governance agenda and, sort of democracy and putting back in place these democratic institutions that had been kind of eroded under the first Rajapaksa government. So lots of competing affects. And in that sort of environment of, aspiration and hope, et cetera, as a sort of, white female ethnographer, I was in some ways the kind of like perfect avatar of the type of person that people, wanted to be in Colombo, right? So there was obviously like a lot that my skin color and my appearance kind of was able to do for me in terms of circulating in elite spaces in the city. And I was always very conscious of that. But I think that what was interesting with that was that because of my kind of Western background, people spoke to me in a really specific way about some of these things. And there was a lot of assumption almost before I could even, start an interview that I would be kind of against the Rajapaksa government, that I was deeply critical, that I hated the port city, that because I grew up in the US and, speak with an American accent, that I would be sort of wanting more US influence on Sri Lanka, that kind of thing. So it was quite interesting the way that things became very determined, at the outset in a lot of conversations about the port city. There was often an assumption. I found something people would do often was sort of say like, well, you're an American, so obviously you hate China, but, we think that China's really great, or we want more Chinese investment, or that kind of thing. And then similarly, I think other people who were more skeptical of the port city would kind of do the opposite. They would kind of, try to interpolate me as like an ally, sort of saying like, oh, you must agree with us because, you probably dislike China. And, in a lot of my, something I've always sort of said is that my agenda is not to advocate for either the US or China to have, greater influence on Sri Lankan affairs, but it was often hard to sort of get that across to my interlocutors. So yeah, there was a really complicated interplay of nationality, race, gender and class kind of in other elements of my research. But I think in this instance, in terms of the port city specifically, nationality was a huge part of my positionality and how I was read.
That's very interesting. I really appreciate that answer. Yeah, we have time for one more question, or a couple actually.
Yeah, and no pressure. I mean, I'm happy to conclude early if there aren't too many other questions. It's just been really nice to be able to share some of this work in progress with everyone.
Yeah, Iromi, let me get your hand up just a second. There we go. Iromi, can you hear me? Oh, Hi, Iromi. Can we, I think you're muted.
Yeah, it should be okay now, right?
Yeah, we can hear you. Excellent.
Thanks. Hi, Alexandra. It's nice to see you.
Good
And
to
thanks.
see you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Sorry, I was trying to put the question in the box, but I think it's a bit too late for me to be forming coherent sentences. I think I was just curious about what you think about the sort of the the trajectory of the protests or sort of the resistance to Port City, because as you know, initially when it started, the protests were really very much concentrated among the groups that were directly affected by the dredging, so the fisher community and people a little north of Port City. And we didn't really see more of like a sort of a national resistance, or even sort of a general, like a larger civil society resistance, which we always did find interesting given the nature of the Port City project. And then over the years and since of late, that resistance has come from unexpected places, I suppose, like with regard to the Constitution and the various laws that they're trying to plan. And in that sense that it has gone in a different direction, and the initial resistance from the fisher folk and the clergy, that is almost sort of non-existent in that sense. So I was curious as to how you view the trajectory of the resistance to Port City.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question, and something that honestly I'm kind of grappling with and also like trying to make sense of in my own ways. But I think there are sort of a few different interesting elements. So one part of this book chapter, when I actually sort of write it all out, and I chose, sadly, I couldn't pick this part to read, but one of the things that I sort of talk about is one of my encounters with a much more kind of like elite Colombo 7 type person who I was hanging out with at this protest in March. And I talk a little bit about his fairly disparaging attitude towards working class people that were also at the event, and kind of talk about some of the, you know, I think hypocrisy is a very harsh word, but just a little bit of a sense that there was, you know, an element of being at that protest by this person who was sort of there to quote unquote defend fishing communities, but then was also very condescending and patronizing and a bit contemptuous towards those very people. So one thing is that I worry very much that the resistance against the Port City was kind of framed or painted as being for a demographic that then wasn't actually as represented in maybe organizing some of those protests. And the reason that I say that is my paper that I came out with last year in Antipode called The Unstable Coastline is about the fisher communities that were being thought that they could be evicted and were being sort of negatively impacted by the Port City. So that's sort of the next chapter in the book, is looking at the actual fishing communities themselves. But something that I kind of trace there is the reason why some fishermen who I spoke to initially expressed a lot of resistance to the Port City, and then ended up just kind of saying, well, we don't really feel like attending the protests anymore, and we're not really sure that we want to go to put our bodies on the line and our lives on the line to fight against this. And kind of comes back to some of that stuff I was saying before about the very sort of flexible nature, I think, of a lot of Sinhala nationalism in Sri Lanka, but also kind of looking at the way that a lot of fisher people kind of calculated things in a different way, right? They didn't just see the project as being a bad thing when it was sort of rendered in these nationalistic terms as being, you know, sort of for the good of the country, so to speak. So yeah, that your question is basically something I'm still thinking through a lot about, why this resistance kind of declined from some groups and shifted over time.
Excellent. I think it's a good time to call it a day for this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And again, a very special thanks to Alessandra Radicati for presenting her work in progress. It looks very promising, and I, for one, am very excited to read it. I hope you all are too. I'm going to end the recording right now.
Yeah.